The body keeps its own record, separate from whatever the mouth has been trained to withhold. This is true for everyone to some degree, but for an avoidant man specifically, the gap between what his body reveals and what his words are willing to admit can be enormous, wide enough that an entire relationship can unfold almost entirely within that gap, communicated fluently through channels that have nothing to do with language at all. Most explanations of avoidant behaviour focus heavily on speech, on what he says or refuses to say, on the presence or absence of certain phrases. But speech was never actually where his defences were weakest. His body was. What follows is an exploration of exactly how that happens, the specific, physical, behavioural ways an avoidant man's genuine attachment tends to surface, almost involuntarily, through channels his conscious mind never learned to guard as carefully as it guards his words. None of what follows requires him to say anything at all. In fact, as this entire piece will demonstrate, some of the most reliable evidence of his actual feelings exists specifically because it bypasses language entirely, arriving instead through posture, proximity, unconscious physical regulation, and quiet, unspoken acts that were never designed to be noticed or acknowledged in the first place. Anyone listening who has spent time straining to interpret an avoidant man's words, passing every sentence for hidden meaning, only to come away more confused rather than less, deserves to understand that the words were probably never going to be where the real information lived. What follows is an invitation to look somewhere else entirely. It's worth naming briefly why this particular framing, focusing on the body and behaviour rather than on speech, tends to feel unfamiliar or even counterintuitive to most people trying to understand a romantic partner's feelings. Cultural conversation around love and commitment tends to centre overwhelmingly on verbal expression, the words someone says, the promises they make, the explicit conversations they're willing to have about the relationship's future. This emphasis makes sense for a great many relationships, where verbal expression and internal feeling tend to align reasonably closely. But it leaves a significant gap for anyone trying to understand a partner whose internal experience and verbal expression diverge considerably. A gap this exploration has been working to fill by turning attention toward channels that receive far less cultural emphasis, despite being, in this specific context, considerably more reliable. It helps to begin with something foundational about how human nervous systems generally operate around perceived safety versus perceived threat, because this foundation explains almost everything that follows. A nervous system that perceives another person as safe tends to relax in observable, physiological ways that are largely involuntary and considerably harder to fake convincingly than verbal expression ever is. Breathing tends to slow and deepen. Shoulders tend to drop from a raised, guarded position into something looser and more natural. Posture tends to open rather than remain closed or defensively angled. These shifts happen below the level of conscious control for almost everyone, which is precisely what makes them such valuable, reliable sources of information, particularly for someone whose conscious, verbal communication has been so heavily filtered and managed throughout their entire adult life. For an avoidant man specifically, this physiological signature carries even more weight than it might for someone whose verbal communication style already reflects their internal experience relatively transparently. Because his words have been trained over years to withhold and manage vulnerable content before it ever reaches expression, his body becomes, by comparison, a remarkably honest narrator, less practiced at concealment, less capable of maintaining the same disciplined guardedness his verbal communication has mastered. This is where the real information tends to live, in the parts of him that were never trained to lie, simply because nobody, including the avoidant man himself, ever thought to train them. Consider what it actually looks like when this physiological ease appears specifically around one particular person, rather than as a general baseline state. An avoidant man's default physical presentation, especially in unfamiliar or emotionally significant contexts, tends to carry a certain low-grade vigilance. A subtle readiness that most people wouldn't consciously register as unusual, but that nonetheless shapes how he occupies space, how quickly he responds to sounds or movement nearby, how rarely he allows his attention to fully settle in any one place for very long. This vigilance functions as a kind of background operating state, present across most of his interactions, a holdover from years of treating closeness itself as something requiring careful, ongoing management. When this baseline vigilance genuinely relaxes around a specific person, and only around that person, rather than as part of some broader mood or circumstance, it tends to be one of the more reliable, if easily overlooked, signs of genuine emotional safety and attachment. This might show up as an unusual stillness in his body during quiet, shared moments, an absence of the small, restless movements that typically characterize his more guarded interactions elsewhere. It might show up as a willingness to close his eyes, even briefly, in her presence, something that requires a level of felt safety most avoidant men rarely extend, since closing one's eyes represents, at a basic physiological level, a genuine relinquishing of vigilance. It might show up simply in how deeply and how audibly he breathes when they're together, compared to the shallower, more controlled breathing that tends to characterize his more guarded default state. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture an animal that has spent its entire life in an environment requiring constant alertness, always scanning for danger, never fully settling into stillness, even during rest. Then imagine this same animal, in the presence of one specific, trusted companion, finally allowing itself to lie down completely, breathing slow and even, genuinely unguarded in a way it never permits itself to be anywhere else. This isn't a performance. An animal in this state isn't choosing, deliberately, to demonstrate trust. It's simply responding, physiologically and involuntarily, to a genuine absence of perceived threat, something that can't be faked or willed into existence through conscious effort alone. This is remarkably close to what happens inside an avoidant man's body when he's genuinely, deeply attached to someone specific. An involuntary physiological settling that his conscious mind never decided to produce, and in many cases, isn't even fully aware is happening. It's worth naming something important here for anyone listening who has noticed this exact kind of physical ease in an avoidant partner. A stillness, a deeper quality of breath, a body that seems to finally stop bracing when they're together, even while his words remained guarded, minimal, or difficult to interpret through more conventional means. This physical ease is genuinely significant information, considerably harder to fake or perform than verbal reassurance, and its presence deserves to be trusted as real evidence of felt safety and attachment, regardless of how little verbal confirmation accompanied it. It's worth adding a few more specific markers to this particular channel, because physiological ease can manifest in ways that are easy to overlook simply because they seem too small or too ordinary to carry real significance. One such marker involves sleep, specifically how readily and how deeply an avoidant man is able to fall asleep in someone's presence, compared to how he sleeps alone or around people he trusts less completely. Genuine sleep requires a significant relinquishing of vigilance, arguably one of the most vulnerable states a person can occupy, and an avoidant man who sleeps easily, deeply, and without the restless, easily disrupted quality that often characterizes his more guarded baseline state, is offering something genuinely significant, even if he never once mentions or acknowledges it directly. Another marker involves appetite and physical relaxation around food and eating, a domain that might seem unrelated to emotional attachment, but that often reflects underlying nervous system states quite reliably. Genuine relaxation tends to support normal digestive and appetite functioning, while chronic vigilance and guardedness tend to subtly suppress or disrupt these same processes. An avoidant man who eats with genuine ease and enjoyment in someone's presence, without the somewhat clipped, efficient quality that sometimes characterizes eating in more socially guarded contexts, is offering another small but genuine piece of physiological evidence pointing toward real, felt safety. A further marker, somewhat more visible than the others, involves how quickly and how completely an avoidant man's body seems to recover from stress or minor disruption when a specific person is present, compared to how long that same recovery tends to take when he's alone or in less trusted company. Co-regulation, the process by which one nervous system helps another return to a calmer baseline state, is a well-documented phenomenon in human relationships generally, and its presence, observable through how quickly he settles after something frustrating or stressful happens, offers real, physiologically grounded evidence of genuine attachment, considerably more reliable than anything he might say about the same underlying experience. There's a second non-verbal channel worth examining closely, distinct from physiological ease, and it involves the specific, quiet pattern of unprompted acts of care that an avoidant man tends to offer once genuine attachment has developed. Acts performed without any accompanying announcement, explanation, or apparent desire for acknowledgement. Before turning to that channel specifically, it's worth naming why physiological ease alone, however significant, was never going to be sufficient as a single, standalone measure of genuine attachment, which is part of why this exploration continues on to examine additional channels, rather than resting entirely on the first one described. Physiological ease can, in rare cases, develop simply through prolonged, repeated exposure to a specific person, a kind of habituation that doesn't necessarily require deep emotional attachment underneath it, particularly in longer relationships where familiarity alone can produce some of the same physical settling being described here. This is precisely why the additional channels explored throughout this piece matter, offering corroborating evidence that, taken together with physiological ease, builds a considerably more reliable, comprehensive picture than any single channel could provide entirely on its own. This distinction matters enormously because acts of service exist across a wide spectrum of motivation, and not all of them carry the same significance. Some acts of care are performed visibly, deliberately, in ways clearly designed to be noticed and appreciated, functioning almost as a substitute for verbal expression, a way of demonstrating investment through action, precisely because the words themselves feel too exposing to offer directly. These visible acts of service can certainly reflect genuine care, but they remain in their own way still oriented toward being witnessed and acknowledged, still carrying some of the same self-conscious quality that characterizes his more guarded verbal communication. The non-verbal signal, worth paying closer attention to, involves something quieter and less visible than this. Care extended in ways specifically designed not to be noticed at all. Small adjustments made to someone else's comfort or convenience that would go completely unremarked if the recipient never happened to catch them in the act. This might look like small, practical adjustments made preemptively, addressing a minor discomfort or inconvenience before it was ever mentioned or requested, done quietly enough that acknowledging it would almost feel like catching him doing something he hadn't intended to be seen doing. It might look like remembering small, seemingly insignificant preferences, mentioned once, in passing, months earlier, and acting on that memory without any reference back to the original conversation, simply integrating the information silently into how he behaves going forward. This particular pattern, care offered without any apparent desire for acknowledgement, carries unusually significant weight as a nonverbal signal, because it removes the one motivation that might otherwise complicate interpretation, the possibility that the care is being offered strategically, as a substitute for words specifically because it's easier to perform generosity than to speak vulnerability directly. Care that actively avoids being noticed doesn't serve this same strategic function. It reflects something closer to genuine, internalized attentiveness, a quiet, ongoing awareness of another person's needs and comfort that operates independently of whether that attentiveness ever gets witnessed or rewarded. It's worth naming why this specific quality, care that avoids acknowledgement rather than seeking it, tends to be so distinctly characteristic of genuine attachment in avoidant men, rather than simply being a universal trait of thoughtful partners generally. For most avoidant men, drawing attention to an act of care introduces exactly the kind of vulnerable exposure their defenses are organized around avoiding. Being thanked, being acknowledged, having a moment of care named directly and made explicit can feel uncomfortably similar to the kind of direct emotional exchange that triggers his usual retreat. Quiet, unacknowledged care allows the underlying attentiveness to exist and to be expressed without ever requiring him to navigate that particular discomfort, which is precisely why this pattern tends to appear so much more reliably than its more visible, acknowledgement-seeking counterpart. It helps to add further texture to this particular channel because unacknowledged care can take forms subtle enough to be missed entirely, unless someone knows specifically what to look for. One common form involves preemptive problem solving, addressing a source of minor friction or difficulty before it ever becomes significant enough to require discussion, done so quietly that the person benefiting from it might never even realize a problem was heading their way in the first place. Another common form involves a kind of ongoing environmental attentiveness, small adjustments to shared physical space, temperature, lighting, noise, made consistently and without comment, oriented specifically around what makes a particular person most comfortable, distinct from what he might prefer if he were considering only his own comfort in isolation. A further form, somewhat more emotionally significant than the others, involves quietly absorbing minor inconveniences or discomforts himself in order to prevent someone else from having to experience them, choosing the less comfortable option consistently without any accompanying announcement of the sacrifice being made. This particular pattern deserves attention because it directly demonstrates a genuine reordering of priorities, evidence that someone else's comfort has become, at least in this specific context, more significant than his own. A reordering that happens automatically, rather than through any deliberate, effortful decision made in the moment. There's a third significant nonverbal channel worth examining, one that tends to surface specifically in group or semi-public settings, rather than in the more private, one-on-one contexts where the first two signals typically appear. This involves a kind of quiet, largely unconscious, protective positioning, how an avoidant man physically orients himself in relation to a specific person when other people are present, distinct from how he positions himself around people he's less genuinely attached to. This pattern often shows up as a subtle but observable tendency to place himself in a way that offers some form of quiet protection or buffering, positioned slightly between a specific person and a source of noise, crowding, or unpredictability, without ever announcing or explaining why. It can show up as an unconscious tendency to check in visually, brief, easily missed glances that confirm a specific person's continued presence or comfort within a group setting. Glances that happen too quickly and too habitually to reflect any deliberate, conscious decision to monitor. It can also show up in how closely he positions himself physically within a group, a consistent, if subtle, tendency to remain within a closer physical range of one specific person compared to everyone else present, again, without any explicit acknowledgement or explanation offered for the pattern. This kind of protective, orienting behaviour tends to be particularly reliable as a nonverbal signal, precisely because it requires no conscious decision-making in the moment it occurs. It reflects an underlying prioritization operating below the level of deliberate thought, the body's own quiet ranking of who matters most within a given environment, made visible through positioning and attention rather than through anything he would ever consciously choose to announce or explain. This is worth naming clearly for anyone who has noticed this exact pattern, being subtly but consistently positioned toward, checked on, oriented around in group settings by an avoidant partner who otherwise offered little verbal indication of how significant that positioning actually was. It's worth adding an important distinction here, because some men display a kind of generalized protectiveness toward everyone in their social circle, a personality trait unrelated to specific romantic attachment. And this generalized pattern shouldn't be mistaken for the more specific, differentiated signal being described throughout this section. The distinguishing factor involves comparison, specifically whether this protective positioning shows meaningful differentiation toward one particular person compared to everyone else present, rather than remaining evenly distributed across an entire group, regardless of individual relationship. Genuine attachment tends to produce a noticeably asymmetric pattern, positioning and attentiveness that consistently favours one specific person over others, in a way that stands out, even subtly, against his more general baseline behaviour in group settings. A uniformly protective personality trait, applied equally to everyone present, doesn't carry the same specific, individualized significance, however admirable that broader trait might be in its own right. There's a fourth channel worth examining closely because it tends to reveal some of the most significant, if uncomfortable, information available regarding genuine attachment. And it involves how an avoidant man behaves specifically during someone else's moments of visible vulnerability, illness, distress, or exhaustion. Most of an avoidant man's usual relational strategy involves maintaining a degree of composure and control, both regarding his own emotional exposure and regarding how closely he engages with someone else's. Genuine, sustained presence during someone else's difficult, vulnerable moments requires setting aside a significant portion of that usual strategy, remaining engaged and attentive precisely during the kind of emotional intensity his defenses are otherwise organized around managing or avoiding. This means how an avoidant man behaves specifically during someone else's illness, exhaustion, grief, or distress tends to offer unusually clear, reliable information about the depth of his actual attachment, considerably more reliable than his behaviour during easier, lower stakes moments. An avoidant man without genuine deep attachment tends to become somewhat more distant or practically focused during these moments, offering help in a more transactional, task-oriented way, present but not necessarily emotionally engaged, sometimes even finding subtle reasons to create distance until the intensity of the moment passes. An avoidant man experiencing genuine deep attachment tends to behave differently, remaining physically and attentionally present, even when the moment offers no clear, structured task to focus on, sitting with discomfort rather than managing it from a safer distance, tolerating an intensity of shared vulnerability that would ordinarily trigger his usual retreat. This particular pattern deserves special attention because it often represents one of the clearest, most unmistakable nonverbal signals available, precisely because it requires him to override his own strongest, most deeply ingrained defensive instincts in order to remain present at all. Anyone listening who witnessed an avoidant partner stay genuinely and attentively present through their own moments of visible vulnerability or distress, even while remaining guarded and difficult to read verbally throughout the rest of the relationship, experience something genuinely significant. This kind of sustained presence during vulnerability doesn't happen accidentally or without real internal cost for someone whose entire defense structure is built around avoiding exactly this kind of prolonged emotional intensity. It's worth naming a caution here as well, because this particular signal, more than any of the others discussed, requires careful, honest distinction from something that might resemble it superficially without carrying the same significance. Presence during someone else's vulnerability that's motivated primarily by guilt, obligation, or a need to manage how the situation reflects on him personally doesn't carry the same weight as presence motivated by genuine attachment and care. The distinguishing quality tends to involve the specific texture of that presence, whether it feels genuinely attentive and engaged, or whether it feels dutiful, watching the clock, oriented more toward managing the situation efficiently than toward genuine emotional companionship through it. This distinction can be subtle, and it's worth applying real honesty when examining which category a particular instance actually falls into, rather than assuming automatically that any presence during a difficult moment reflects the deeper, more significant pattern being described here. It helps to name a few more specific markers within this particular channel, because the difference between dutiful presence and genuine attachment often reveals itself through small details that are easy to overlook without knowing to look for them specifically. One marker involves eye contact during vulnerable moments, whether it remains genuinely present and engaged, or whether it drifts frequently toward distractions, phones, clocks, or other tasks that offer an easier place to direct attention. Another marker involves physical stillness, whether his body remains settled and present throughout the difficult moment, or whether it carries a restless, fidgety quality, suggesting an underlying discomfort with remaining in the situation any longer than necessary. A further marker involves what happens once the acute intensity of the moment passes, whether he seems to relax naturally back into the relationship's ordinary rhythm, or whether there's a noticeable, almost relieved shift toward distance and normalcy, as though the vulnerable moment itself was something to be endured and then quickly moved past, rather than something that deepened the connection in its own right. This final marker deserves particular attention because genuine attachment tends to produce a specific aftermath following shared vulnerability, a subtle increase in closeness or tenderness that persists beyond the immediate moment, rather than an abrupt return to whatever baseline distance characterized the relationship beforehand. Watching for this aftermath, rather than focusing exclusively on behavior during the vulnerable moment itself, often provides additional, valuable confirmation regarding which category a particular instance of presence actually belongs to. There's a fifth and final nonverbal channel worth examining, one that operates across a considerably longer timescale than the previous four, and it involves consistency itself. Not consistency in any single behavior, but consistency in the overall, sustained pattern of an avoidant man's nonverbal presence across time, regardless of external circumstances. This channel matters because any single instance of physiological ease, quiet care, protective positioning, or presence during vulnerability could, in isolation, be explained away as a momentary exception rather than a genuine, ongoing pattern. It's the sustained repetition of these signals, across weeks and months, across good days and difficult ones, across moments of stress and moments of ease, that ultimately transforms isolated instances into something considerably more trustworthy, a genuine, reliable pattern, rather than a series of disconnected, potentially coincidental moments. This distinction between isolated instance and sustained pattern deserves real emphasis, because it protects against one of the more common mistakes people make when searching for nonverbal evidence of an avoidant partner's genuine feelings, seizing on a single meaningful moment and treating it as though it settles the question definitively, when a single instance, however moving in the moment it occurred, simply doesn't carry the same evidentiary weight as a pattern sustained reliably over meaningful time. Anyone genuinely trying to understand whether an avoidant man's nonverbal behavior reflects real, sustained attachment would be wise to resist forming a confident conclusion based on any single occurrence, however striking, and instead watch for whether these signals, taken together, continue appearing reliably across an extended period, through circumstances that vary considerably, rather than remaining conveniently consistent. It's worth addressing something important here, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misapplied if treated as a checklist to search for evidence within, rather than as a framework for honest observation. Not every avoidant man who displays occasional physical ease, occasional unacknowledged care, occasional protective positioning, or occasional presence during vulnerability is necessarily experiencing the depth of genuine attachment being described throughout this exploration. These signals carry real significance, specifically when they appear consistently, together, and across meaningful time, not when a single instance of one particular signal gets isolated and treated as conclusive evidence on its own. Genuine self-honesty in applying this framework matters considerably more than eager pattern matching that forces ambiguous behaviour into a comforting, more significant category than it actually deserves. It's worth adding one further caution here, because it protects against a subtle but common mistake in how this entire framework sometimes gets applied. Watching for these signals too actively, too vigilantly, treating every interaction as an opportunity to gather evidence, can itself introduce a kind of tension into the relationship that makes genuine, involuntary, non-verbal ease considerably less likely to appear in the first place. Nervous systems relax around safety, not around scrutiny. And a relationship approached primarily as an ongoing investigation tends to produce exactly the kind of guardedness this entire exploration has been trying to help identify and understand. rather than allowing the natural, unforced ease that these signals actually depend on to develop and express itself freely. It's worth addressing something practical here, because recognizing these nonverbal signals accurately naturally raises a question about how to respond to them in the moment, and mishandling that response can sometimes disrupt the very ease that allowed the signal to appear in the first place. Much like the more specific verbal slip discussed in other explorations of this topic, these nonverbal signals tend to be best received quietly, without immediate, explicit acknowledgement, particularly in the moment they first occur. Drawing sudden, direct attention to a moment of physical ease, an unacknowledged act of care or protective positioning within a group setting, tends to introduce exactly the kind of conscious self-awareness that can interrupt the very involuntary quality that made the signal meaningful in the first place. Once he becomes consciously aware that his body or his quiet actions revealed something he hadn't intended to reveal, some avoidant men respond with a subtle but noticeable retreat, an unconscious effort to reassert the guardedness that had, for a moment, genuinely relaxed. This doesn't mean these signals should never be acknowledged at all, only that timing and framing matter considerably. Over time, as these patterns repeat consistently across many separate occasions, gentle, low-pressure acknowledgement becomes both reasonable and often genuinely welcome, particularly when it's offered with warmth rather than analysis, appreciation rather than scrutiny. There's a meaningful difference between quietly thanking someone for a small, thoughtful gesture in a way that feels natural and unremarkable, and explicitly naming the deeper psychological significance of that gesture in a way that turns an unconscious act of care into a subject of formal examination. The first tends to feel safe. The second tends to feel like exposure. And exposure, for an avoidant man, remains something his system continues working to avoid, regardless of how much genuine attachment might exist underneath that avoidance.